So before I introduce Dr. List, I want to let you know that his visit with us is part of the Spring 2021 Speaker Series sponsored by the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics, the Department of Philosophy, Phi Sigma Tau, and the Center for Ethics Student Forum. The series, Ethical Dialogues Across the Virtual University, Multidisciplinary Perspectives, will bring numerous international scholars to campus for public talks with Georgia State classes, students, and faculty. I was lucky enough to have Dr. List visit my class last week. The distinguished guests will share their research and meet with our community in constructive dialogue about enduring ethical issues in the humanities and social sciences. Further information about the series is available at the Ethics Center website, ethics.gsu.edu. And I'm going to put into the chat link shortly a link to the list of events coming up over the next few months. The next talk in the series will be by Elizabeth Brake from Rice University with a talk about the ethics of stalking. I also want to advertise a talk in the Neurophilosophy Forum series by Alison Gopnik 1 week from today, February 19th at 3 p.m. Life History and Learning, How Children and Elders Shaped the Human Mind. And I'll put a link to that info in the chat as well. Dr. List joins us from, at past 7 p.m. Munich time in Germany, where he is the professor of philosophy and decision theory and co-director of the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy at Ludwig Maximilian University. He recently moved there from the London School of Economics, where he remains a visiting professor. Dr. List is a truly interdisciplinary scholar, an expert in philosophy of the social sciences, decision theory, political science, philosophy of action, and more. He's published over 80 articles with a wide range of co-authors in journals, philosophy ones such as Noose, Journal of Philosophy, Philosophical Review, and in interdisciplinary journals like Social Choice and Welfare and Journal of Economic Theory. He has 4 edited volumes, and he's the author with Philip Pettit of Group Agency, The Possibility, Design, and Status of Corporate Agents, which I'm sure he'll be drawing on today. And most recently, his book, Why Free Will is Real, won the APA's Gittler Award. And I can attest that it is an excellent book and a great introduction to the topic and a defense of free will against some of the scientific challenges that have been lodged against it in recent years. Today, Dr. List will talk to us about group agency and artificial intelligence. And while we'd love to have Dr. List join us in Atlanta in person, and hopefully that'll happen someday, in the meantime, please join me in welcoming Christian List to our virtual reality. And this is where we would have a round of applause that he could hear. But for now, we'll just have to have the icons and the imagined applause. Thank you, Dr. List, for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation and also for the very nice introduction. And I'm very happy to be with you, albeit just virtually. And it'll be nice, of course, at some point to then also get together in person. So that'll have to wait until the COVID crisis is over. So the work that I'm presenting tonight or today is really a kind of big picture overview of some themes that I think are of interdisciplinary significance, both in action theory on the one hand and in ethics and political philosophy on the other hand. The talk will really focus on big picture ideas. The various details and also literature references can be found in the written paper, which is available on my webpage. And in fact, at the moment, I'm revising the paper. So in due course, probably at some point in the next few weeks, there'll be a somewhat updated version of the paper as well. Okay, so my aim really is to encourage a conversation about parallels between 2 phenomena that have received a fair amount of attention in recent years, namely group agency on the one hand and artificial intelligence on the other. And both phenomena basically have to do with systems that are distinct from individual human beings, but which nonetheless qualify as intentional agents, and which in some cases might qualify even as moral agents. And then there's a whole host of questions that the arrival of these novel moral agents in our social world raises. So what I want to argue is that despite some salient differences, these two phenomena really raise some rather similar metaphysical and moral issues, and some insights generated in debates about group agency, which have been going on for a while in philosophy now, can also carry over to debates about robots and computational systems. And my talk will be subdivided roughly into 3 parts. I'll begin with some introduction to the two phenomena, and I'll then talk a bit about the key parallel and how we can think about it. And then I will discuss the normative lessons in a bit more detail, focusing specifically on lessons for issues of responsibility on the one hand, and lessons for issues of the assignment of rights on the other hand. So let's begin with the two phenomena, and I'll start with group agency. Now, I'm going to understand group agency as the phenomenon that some organized collectives can constitute goal-directed agents in their own right over and above their individual members. Paradigmatic examples are commercial corporations, let's say British Petroleum, collegial courts, NGOs, and even states in their entirety. In fact, there are some areas in the social sciences, such as the so-called realist theory of international relations, which models states like the United States as a unitary actor, at least for some purposes of studying strategic relations with other such actors. Obviously, this involves a certain amount of abstraction and simplification, but it turns out to be certainly a useful mode of analysis. Now, we tend to ascribe beliefs, desires, and intentions to such collective entities, and at least sometimes we treat them as loci of action. So, you can even have a legal dispute with a corporate agent, which is then not a legal dispute with any one of its members, but with the entity as a whole. We assess their actions in terms of standards of rationality, which are not unlike those that we also apply to individuals. If you think about the theory of the firm in economics, that models firms, corporations as rational utility maximizing agents, and indeed applies very similar standards of rationality to them that economics also applies to, for instance, individual human market participants in consumer theory. Now, you might think that the ascription of agency and intentional attitudes to collectives is just a metaphor. So let's say when we say that Microsoft intends to increase profits, that's just a shorthand for saying that the managers, board members, or shareholders have this intention. Or when we say the Roman Catholic Church is committed to certain values, that's just a shorthand for saying that individual Catholics have those commitments. But I think there is an indispensability argument for treating group agency as not just metaphorical but real. And I personally find this indispensability argument really quite persuasive insofar as it's structurally very similar to other indispensability arguments that we give in the philosophy of science for the reality of other entities that we study in the sciences, entities such as particles, atoms, molecules, and so on. So how does this argument go? Well, I'll summarize it just very quickly here. The first premise of the argument asserts that the ascription of intentional agency to certain organized collectives is explanatorily indispensable if we wish to make sense of the behavior of these collective entities. I already alluded to the point that economists model firms as unitary agents, and that turns out to be explanatorily indispensable for certain purposes in economics. Or I also alluded to realist theories of international relations, which do this in the case of states. And there are scientific disputes about this, but if those scholars are right, then at least for some explanatory purposes, it might be occasionally explanatorily indispensable to ascribe agency to a state as a whole. The second premise of the argument asserts that if the ascription of some property to an entity is indispensable for explaining that entity's behavior, then we are at least at first sight warranted in assuming that the entity really has that property. That's a principle also known as the naturalistic ontological attitude. It's a principle that underlies the case for realism in other areas of the sciences as well. It's broadly on the basis of such a principle that physicists, for instance, might be realists about certain fundamental elementary particles. Our best physical theories of the world postulate those fundamental particles, and if we really think these theories are good theories, and invoking those particles turns out to be indispensable for certain explanations, then we take their commitments at face value. And now if we put these two premises together, the conclusion follows that we are, at least at first sight, warranted in assuming that the collectives in question really are intentional agents. We basically take the ascription of agency to those collectives, insofar as it is made in the context of good social scientific theories, really as capturing a real phenomenon and not just as a sort of fiction or metaphor. And I think, if you are disposed towards realism in the philosophy of science, then this is actually a perfectly fine argument. And at least for the purposes of the talk tonight, I'll embrace the argument here and then move to the next phenomenon that I want to look at, namely artificial intelligence. Now, this is the phenomenon that certain artificial, for instance, computational or robotic systems, display certain forms of intelligence, intentionality, autonomous agency that is analogous in some respects to the intelligence or agency that we normally attribute to humans or other complex animals. Examples of AI systems are driverless cars, unmanned air vehicles, drones, especially those that are not piloted by a remote pilot, but that are genuinely autonomous in pursuing their, for instance, navigational tasks, care assistant robots in medicine, autonomous financial trading software systems in financial markets, and there are an increasing number of examples like this, coming up almost on a daily basis now. People often distinguish between strong and weak forms of artificial intelligence. Strong AI refers to machine intelligence that is comparable to or stronger than human intelligence on certain dimensions. Now that can be spelled out not necessarily along one single spectrum, but there might be a variety of different dimensions along which we might assess those capacities. But generally, strong AI is always used as a label for systems that in some respects match human agential abilities. Weak AI, on the other hand, refers to machine intelligence that is weaker than or more specialized or less general than human intelligence. It's fair to say that most AI systems that we have at this point are probably still on the weak side, and we are, only perhaps gradually moving towards strong AI. And if you ask different people, they'll give you very different answers to the question of how far we are from genuinely strong AI systems, and whether those will be realistically developed anytime soon or not. Now, my focus here is on AI systems that don't just solve certain number crunching tasks, but systems that we would describe as displaying a certain amount of intentionality or autonomy. And I think the class of such systems is definitely non-empty and increasing. As I'm sure you've heard, I mean, there are now driverless car systems, for instance, that can autonomously drive, very long distances, navigate, complex traffic situations on their own, and really fulfill a rather sophisticated mission very much without any human input or human piloting along the way. And so on the face of it, you can think of such a system, at least, somewhat moving away just from the mere traditional number crunching of a computer. Okay, so what is the parallel between group agency and AI? And the key parallel is really a very simple and obvious one. It lies in the fact that in both cases, we are dealing with systems that are distinct from individual human beings and also distinct from other animals, which nonetheless qualify as intentional agents of some sort. And to make this a bit more precise, I want to define intentional agency, and I'll just give you a very simple definition, which could then be tweaked and enriched in a variety of ways. On a first gloss, an intentional agent is a system normally embedded within some environment that meets at least three conditions. First of all, the system has representational states. Those are states that encode the system's beliefs about how things are in the environment. For instance, I might have to believe that coffee is available in a particular place, but so might a servant robot, which also has that belief, by representing the environment in that way. Secondly, the system has motivational states. These are states that encode the system's desires, so to speak, as to how the system would like things to be in the environment. In my case, this could be a desire to get coffee, or a system, let's say the self-driving car could have a motivational state that is specified that the system intends to drive to Las Vegas, for instance. And then crucially, the system has a capacity to systematically interact with its environment in pursuit of its desires on the basis of its beliefs, for instance, by acting in such a way as to get coffee in my simple example. And indeed, this is just a very standard belief desire model of agency, or version of it is sometimes also called the belief desire intention model of agency. Some very original version of it goes back at least to David Hume. A more recent belief desire intention version of this was influentially developed by scholars such as Michael Bratman. But I would argue that that's also the picture of agency that is at the heart, not just of many philosophical definitions of agency, but also at the heart of many definitions of agency in computer science. Now, consistently with these three conditions, agents can vary considerably in their capacities and sophistication. An agent's psychology, so by this I mean the internal states and cognitive structure that underpin the agent's external behavior, this can range from very simple to extremely complex. Humans obviously have a huge variety of psychological states beyond those beliefs and desires, so beyond those simple representation and motivations. In the human case, there are emotions, hopes and fears, all sorts of subconscious mental states, all of which play certain roles in the person's psychology and in the person's interaction with the world, whereas in a much simpler AI agent, for instance, those might be, or those are most very likely to be absent. Now, evidently systems ranging from non-human animals to robots, but also suitably organized collectives can in principle satisfy these conditions for agency. There is absolutely nothing in these conditions that implies that only humans or other primates or other mammals or specific biological organisms can satisfy them. Indeed, any system that is functionally organized in the right way can in principle satisfy them. Conceptually, therefore, there is no barrier for a commercial corporation to qualify as an intentional agent if it's organized in the right way, or for an autonomous robot, let's say a self-driving car or a drone, to do so. And as I've already noted, our best social scientific theories of many phenomena do attribute agency to certain organized collectives. And in fact, you could view group agents such as corporations as special cases of AI systems. I mean, that's a kind of perspective that is less frequently adopted, but of course, group agents are artificial entities. They are socially designed entities. But they are artificial in a sort of very special way, namely the hardware supporting the artificial intelligence happens to be social rather than electronic. You can think of this as a social implementation of an AI system. Rohit Parikh, the logician and theoretical computer scientist, has coined the term social software to refer to an idea along these lines. Now, this notion that AI is a form of artificial or engineered intentional agency is also implicit in the famous Turing Test for AI, which incidentally, I think we could also in principle apply for a group agent. This test is whether the system behaves, for instance, through its communication in ways that would lead a human observer to attribute human-like agential capacities to it. And the idea behind this test is very similar to the idea that underlies Daniel Dennett's influential notion of the intentional stance that he uses to think about agency. So for Dennett, a system qualifies as an intentional agent if that system is usefully and voluminously predictable from the intentional stance. That is, we can successfully predict and explain the system's behavior if we view it as an agent. So for Dennett, to be an agent is to be interpretable as an agent. On this interpretivist definition, robots and group agents would then qualify as agents for pretty much the same reason. In both cases, the systems in question are usefully and voluminously predictable from the intentional stance. That would be the case both if you take a commercial corporation that engages in rational profit maximization, and it would also apply in the case of the self-driving car that drives to Las Vegas. So Deborah Tollefson, for instance, has developed an explicitly interpretivist theory of group agency in a 2015 book defending that perspective in order to make the case for group agency. Now, I prefer a stronger realist definition according to which interpretability as an agent is evidence for intentional agency, but not conceptually the same as intentional agency. So for the interpretivist, to be an agent is to be interpretable as an agent, whereas on the stronger definition that I favor, to be an agent is to satisfy the three conditions for agency that I introduced earlier on. And then interpretability as an agent might be useful, observable evidence for that. But in any case, irrespective of whether you adopt the interpretivist view or the stronger realist view that I favor and that Philip Pettit and I use in our own theory of group agency, group agents and AI systems arguably satisfy those agency conditions, and they do so through a different hardware, a social hardware in one case and an electronic hardware in the other case, which is just very much in line with the classic philosophical point that functionalists about agency often make, namely that agency is a multiply realizable phenomenon. That is to say, you could have many different systems that instantiate agency, and so we can have biological hardware for agency as in the human case, social as in the corporate case, and electronic as in the AI case. Okay, of course a lot more could be said about the notion of agency and also about the details of how group agency and AI works, and some metaphysical questions, for instance, in the philosophy of mind, that are raised by viewing corporations and AI systems as intentional agents. But I'll set this aside and turn now to some normative questions. And specifically, I want to ask, what lessons might we learn for the issue of responsibility in light of this parallel between group agency and AI, and what lessons might we learn for issues of rights and moral status of the entities in question. So let's begin with responsibility. I think one respect in which group agency and artificial intelligence really raise very similar challenges concerns precisely the issue of moral and legal responsibility. Now, let's begin with group agency. As is widely recognized, group agents, for instance, states or corporations, have a huge amount of power in the social world, and they can also cause significant harms. Quite often, they can cause much greater harms than individuals ever do. And in such cases of collectively caused harms, it is sometimes hard to identify one or several individuals to whom we can reasonably attribute all of the responsibility. I mean, of course, there will be individuals involved in typical cases, and they bear some responsibility for what has happened, so that's beyond doubt. But sometimes it's hard to pinpoint, one or several identifiable individuals to whom all of the responsibility is attributable. And let me take an example that Philip Pettit gave in a 2007 article. In 1987, the Herald of Free Enterprise, a ferry that was operating in the English Channel, sank on its route from Belgium to Dover in the UK, and it drowned nearly 200 people. So this was one of the biggest ferry disasters in the English Channel ever. And an official inquiry that was then conducted found that the company operating the ferry was extremely sloppy. It had poor safety routines and poor procedures. One commentator wrote, from top to bottom, the body corporate was infected with the disease of sloppiness. I mean, you also see this sort of anthropomorphist language here. But nonetheless, despite a very complex legal aftermath of the whole thing, no one was found legally responsible to an intuitively appropriate extent. And so the same commentator observed that the primary requirement of finding an individual who was liable stood in the way of attaching any significance to the organizational sloppiness. There was a shortfall in legal responsibility because the ferry company was not treated as a locus of responsible agency. So at the time, the issue of responsibility was really approached very much through the lens of individualism, and individual responsibility was the focal notion. And then it turned out that individual responsibility could not be satisfactorily apportioned here, precisely because there was a sort of missing corporate locus of responsibility there, to which the law was just simply blind. So generally, as this kind of example illustrates, and there are many others, the sum total of individual responsibility may sometimes fail to do justice, intuitively speaking, to the full amount of harm caused. Intuitively, in such cases, there is then a responsibility gap. Now, often we can avoid such responsibility gaps only by recognizing that group agents can be held corporately responsible. So once we recognize, for instance, the ferry company as a group agent and as a possible locus of responsibility, then we can say, well, now we have identified an agent that is capable of bearing the responsibility in question. Now, in a very similar way, responsibility gaps may arise due to harms caused by AI systems. As already noted, such systems are increasingly common in areas as diverse as transportation, the military, financial markets, and medicine, and there are many other areas. Now, as these systems operate autonomously and increasingly in high-stakes environments where they make some genuine decisions without immediate human guidance or immediate human input, the occurrence of some harms is in practice inevitable. And there have already been headlines of accidents that were caused by self-driving cars operating autonomously rather than by their human operators. Now, due to the system's design, which might involve, for instance, opaque and hard to understand deep learning algorithms, at least some of these harms may not be foreseeable and may not be easily traceable to transparent design flaws that you can easily identify. And it's then not clear that full responsibility for such harms can always be attributed to humans, such as operators, developers, owners, and regulators. Rather, it's at least conceivable that the sum total of human responsibility may sometimes fail to do justice to the full amount of harm caused. Now, in that case, you could say that's just a tragic accident, like an avalanche or natural disaster or something, where just a confluence of totally unforeseeable factors and complexity and so on led to some catastrophic chain of events and nobody is to blame for it. That would be one way to look at it. But on the other hand, you might also say, well, perhaps we are overlooking a possible locus of responsibility if we don't take into account the possibility that the system as a whole, the AI system, could be a responsible agent in its own right. So in such cases, there could be responsibility gaps, much like in the corporate case. And this then raises the question of whether we can avoid such gaps by attributing responsibility to the AI systems themselves and what exactly that would mean. Now, at first sight, you might think that there is a disanalogy between group agents and AI systems when it comes to responsibility. Group agents, after all, are collectives of individual humans. So what a group agent does is determined by what the members do. And insofar as these human members are themselves responsible agents, perhaps in the corporate case, we can expect a close connection between corporate and member responsibility. On the other hand, AI systems are in principle more autonomous. Once they are designed and set loose in the environment, they go about doing their business with no more human input required. You could even imagine cases not unrealistic from a computer science perspective where the AI systems are designed partly through a process of evolutionary software generation. There is this evolutionary software paradigm where you evolve software algorithms rather than explicitly design them. And in this kind of case, the system could be really the output of some kind of virtual evolutionary environment where there is very little human input in the design. I mean, apart from maybe specifying the initial parameters of setting up this process. So a great deal of autonomy is conceivable in the case of an AI system. And setting aside hybrid systems, such systems can then operate with little or no human input. So I'm not interested here in, for instance, drones with remote pilots, because that's a very different kind of case. But I would say that the analogy is actually not so extreme. After all, also in the corporate case, member responsibility is not a matter of conceptual necessity. If we take the logic of group agency seriously, then individuals are responsible only to the extent that their individual agency is relevantly involved or implicated in a group agent's actions. For instance, due to enacting roles as knowing or willing officials or representatives of the group agent, due to authorizing roles, maybe as directors, owners, or shareholders, and due to organizational design roles as founders, framers, policymakers, or regulators. But the key conceptual point is that a group agent constitutes a different locus of agency from each individual member. And so we must not confuse those loci of agency. And for this reason, any relationship that there is between corporate responsibility and individual member responsibility is really contingent matter, which depends on details of how this group agent is organized. It's not a matter of conceptual necessity. It would just be a non sequitur to claim that just because the group agent has done something wrong, the members must have done something wrong. This may or may not be the case, depending on the specifics of the situation we are looking at. Now, turning to responsibility and AI. An AI system, as I've already argued, constitutes a new locus of agency as well. But I mean, here also other agents, be they individuals or corporations, may be involved or implicated to some extent in the AI system's actions. Also due to enacting roles as technical operators, due to authorizing roles as owners or service providers, or due to system design roles as creators, software designers, policymakers, or regulators. In fact, you've got a kind of very parallel situation in that both in relation to these corporate AI agents, the social case, and the more electronic case of what we conventionally call AI, some individual humans play these normatively significant roles, which may mean that they are implicated and which may mean that they share a portion of the responsibility for what is done. But the locus of agency in each case is different in the system as compared to the human individuals. So in analogy to the corporate case, then it's a contingent question to what extent some other agents might be partly responsible for what an AI system does. And the answer will also vary from case to case. If we wish to avoid responsibility gaps in AI systems, we might therefore need to consider the attribution of responsibility to the AI systems themselves over and above their operators, owners, or regulators. And that's a kind of intriguing possibility. But as in the case of group agency, it would also be a mistake to derive the conclusion that a system should be assigned responsibility simply from the premise that such responsibility assignments are necessary for avoiding responsibility gaps. That would be a complete non sequitur. I mean, from the fact that, you know, an avalanche causes a lot of harm and that's somehow regrettable, we can't draw the conclusion yet that therefore we should attribute responsibility to the avalanche. So, you know, likewise, from the fact that an AI system causes some catastrophic harm, it does not automatically follow that the AI system is therefore responsible. Rather, we must independently establish a system's fitness to be held responsible. What are the conditions that a system must meet for fitness to be held responsible? And here I think those conditions are also kind of you know, parallel in the corporate case and in the AI case, and indeed I would argue in the human case as well. So following the conditions as Philip Pettit and I proposed them in our book on group agency, the first of these conditions is the moral agency condition. The system must be a moral agent, which has the capacity and principle to make normative judgments about its choices. That goes beyond mere intentional agency and needs further spelling out, which can be done in a variety of different ways. The second condition is the epistemic condition. The system must have the information and access to evidence needed for assessing its choices normatively. And then the third condition is the control condition. The system must have the control required for choosing between its options. Which kinds of systems meet those conditions? Well, again, that's a contingent question, you know, whether a biological, electronic, or social system that you're looking at meets all three. In the biological case, only humans meet them. The moral agency condition would exclude non-human animals. In the social case, Philip Pettit and I have argued that suitably organized group agents can in fact meet them, and a critical condition is moral agency, but we do suggest that if a corporate structure is designed in the right kind of way, then it should be indeed possible for a group agent to engage in normative cognition, so as to also make normative judgments and not just have these you know, simpler representational and motivational states required for intentional agency. Now, one might indeed suggest that society, via its regulatory authorities, should permit the creation of powerful new group agents, for instance, corporations or other organizations, only if structures are in place to ensure their fitness to be held responsible. I mean, there could be there could be a regulatory standard that says if you want an operating license for a powerful group agent in the social world, you better have to make sure that this is designed not just as a mere intentional agent that, for instance, very systematically goes about maximizing its profits, but the system must also be designed in such a way as to meet more demanding moral agency conditions. That's a choice for a society to make and to implement via its regulatory authorities. Moving on to AI, here too, I would suggest that it's a contingent question whether a given AI system meets these stronger conditions for fitness to be held responsible over and above the mere intentional agency conditions. And the growing research program on engineering moral agents is an attempt to find ways of implementing some form of moral agency in AI. And I would suggest that while there are clearly significant technical challenges here, there's conceptually no reason why an AI system couldn't satisfy also the conditions for moral agency, depending on its design. And so this, I think, suggests a kind of parallel regulatory proposal for AI systems, we might say that society, via its regulatory authorities, should permit the use of new AI systems, at least when they are supposed to operate in high-stakes environments, only if structures are in place to ensure their fitness to be held responsible, or if this is somehow not feasible, as a backup, if full transfer of responsibility is arranged to their legal representatives, maybe on the model of a strict liability regime in some other parts of the industry. So here the idea would be, if you want to get an operating license to use an AI system in a high stakes setting, either make sure that the AI system is designed not just to intentional agency, but to certain moral agency specifications that the regulator must set, or alternatively, put some very strict liability system or something along those lines in place that achieves a full liability transfer to legal representatives of the system, who would then not be able to use something like a responsibility gap as a possible defense for against liability. So structures to achieve something like moral agency in an AI system may include, but need not be restricted to, certain non-negotiable ethical constraints on the system's behavior, but most importantly, I think, an explicit implementation of moral norms in an AI system. And there are different strategies for doing this, either top-down by kind of explicitly programming systems to be moral agents, or perhaps bottom-up through having machine learning algorithms that are actually trained to do moral pattern recognition, as opposed to just a kind of standard pattern recognition for tasks for which they are already designed. I mean, in the same way in which we design those systems to do pattern recognition in relation to X-ray images, in principle, the systems could also be set up to do pattern recognition in relation to certain normatively charged situations. But that raises, many complicated challenges. For instance, what should the training database for such a system be? And I'll skip the ethical black box. Okay, so that's a whole bunch of lessons learned, or maybe questions raised for the issue of responsibility. So let me move on a bit more briefly to the issue of rights and moral status. Now, if we regard group agents and AI systems as agents of their own, should we then also give them rights? Should we agree, for instance, with the Citizens United decision of the US Supreme Court that gives relatively broad free speech rights to be exercised via monetary spending to commercial corporations? That's a sort of corporate example of a rights dispute one might have about corporations. We could imagine similar questions also for AI systems. Now, in our book on group agency, Philip Pettit and I asserted a normative asymmetry between individual agents and group agents. We argued that while group agents should be held responsible for their corporate actions, both in the moral and also in the legal sense, they should not be given the same rights as individuals. We insisted, and I quote us then, that group agents should be given only those rights that are defensible within normative individualism, and often should be subject to especially strict checks and controls. Now, we were criticized for not sufficiently justifying this normative asymmetry between individuals and groups. Ray Briggs, for instance, very nicely articulated this criticism. So the question was, how can we defend this criticism in light of having adopted a relatively functionalist account of agency? Why be normative individualists if we are functionalists about agency? Why not assign rights when a system, whether it is individual or collective or indeed artificial, meets the functional requirements for moral agency? Shouldn't that be good enough for rights as much as it is good, or as well as it is good enough for responsibility? Now, what I want to suggest is that a key difference in moral significance between individuals and group agents stems from their difference with respect to consciousness. Individual human beings are phenomenally conscious, while group agents arguably are not. And I think it's quite plausible to say that only phenomenally conscious agents, or at least those with the potential for phenomenal consciousness, can have non-derivative rights. That is, rights which are justified, not just instrumentally in terms of their usefulness for something else, but rights that can be justified by reference, for instance, to some intrinsic moral status of the system. So phenomenal consciousness on this picture, or the potential for it, would be a necessary condition for having non-derivative rights, though perhaps not quite a sufficient condition. Now, corporations on this picture can still have derivative rights. So my university here can obviously enter into contractual relations, and it has all sorts of legal rights associated with that. It can own property and so on and so on. But those rights are not justified by reference to any particular intrinsic moral status of the university, but they are justified by reference to consequentialist considerations. It's a good thing for society as a whole if universities as group agents have those rights. And so we should think of those as derivative rights rather than non-derivative ones. Now, would this criterion of consciousness of the potential for consciousness as a necessary condition for non-derivative rights, would that criterion also yield the same verdict for AI systems, so that it would then also allow us to establish an asymmetry between AI systems and humans? So AI systems perhaps can have responsibility, but not quite rights. Well, I think the answer depends very much on the AI system in question. I'll make only two brief remarks here. On the one hand, I think there is no reason at all to think that current AI systems, which are entirely based on conventional computational architectures, meet anything like the preconditions for phenomenal consciousness. If people are interested, I can spell this out in a bit more detail in Q&A and say why I think this is so. But I don't think I'm saying anything particularly controversial here. I think that hardly anyone would claim that even the most sophisticated AI systems that we have right now is phenomenally conscious. And that's just not a view that is particularly defended. Now, if this is correct, then current AI systems would be at most like corporations in their moral status. So, perhaps if it turned out to be somehow useful in a consequentialist sense, they might in the future have derivative rights, much like the university that can have derivative rights, but most definitely not non-derivative ones. On the other hand, there is the possibility, at least, that future biomorphic AI systems, ones whose cognitive architecture is modeled somewhat more on something like the human brain, might become phenomenally conscious. And at that point, if that were to materialize, that's still science fiction right now, then those AI systems might conceivably acquire a stronger moral status than group agents. They might be not just moral agents, but possibly genuine objects of moral concern. I mean, that's completely uncharted terrain at the moment and still science fiction, but I think it's a scenario worth thinking about from a philosophical perspective. So to wrap up, evidently agency is a multiply realizable phenomenon, which admits at least three different kinds of hardware: biological, the paradigmatic case is the human and animal one; social, as in the corporate case; and artificial or engineered, as in the AI case. Now, I think investigating each of these cases in isolation is less interesting for the purposes that I've discussed here than investigating them together. And I think it's quite useful to identify the lessons that the study of agency in any one of these cases yields for the others. And there's some useful cross-fertilization there. Since both group agents and AI systems are artificial systems that constitute goal-directed agents, they raise some similar metaphysical and moral questions. And in both cases in particular, we are dealing with agents beyond the human individual. And then it's important for us as a society to come to terms with the fact that in increasingly complex technologically advanced societies, the loci of agency go well beyond individual human beings. And we then have to make sure that our normative concepts and categories, for instance, our criteria for responsibility and moral status, can handle the presence of such diverse loci of agency in the world. After all, our moral concepts and categories are still very much designed around the the paradigm case of humans as the loci of agency, and for many purposes that is I guess still the right perspective, but for some purposes at least we need to come to terms with the arrival of new loci of agency. So thank you very much. I can't hear you, Eddie. You're muted. Okay, how do I make you host now? Eddie, you should be the host now. And you're still muted.
Yes, okay.
Great, okay.
Thank you. Everybody's got their hands up, but I'm sure they're clapping too. And thank you for being the guinea pig for our first use of Zoom for these meetings. We're figuring it out. So we've basically, I'm gonna see if I can let people unmute themselves. If not, I'll unmute you when I call on you. If you're willing to put your camera on for the conversation, I think that would be nice for Christian to talk with you. If not, that's fine too. And I see a bunch of hands, but I'm trying to follow our attempt to have some grad students get the first questions. So I see at least one, but if others want to raise their hands, I'll call on you. We'll start with Anastasia. And Anastasia, can you unmute yourself or not? No, okay. So. But I'm the host. Okay.
I think it worked.
Okay.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm really intrigued by the discussion of phenomenal consciousness and partly the role that it plays in the rights attributions or perhaps moral patiency. And partly you were discussing it as potentially, just scenarios of science fiction. But I'm wondering to what extent is the displayed amount of intentionality and autonomy contingent on our perceptions or the interpreter's perceptions of those autonomy and agency present in AIs. And from what you were saying, it seemed to me that, as you said, it can be evidence for there actually being agency or intentionality, even if it's not conceptually the same. I wonder if we had the kinds of AI robotic systems, perhaps, that are sufficiently similar to humans, which would allow us to make certain inferences about the phenomenal consciousness, just driving, based on some work on phenomenal consciousness descriptions and the relevance of the right sort of body. If interpreters were able to genuinely perceive the phenomenal consciousness, or some evidence of phenomenal consciousness, do you think that would suffice for actual attributions of moral patiency and rights as well, if phenomenal consciousness is indeed something that drives that moral patiency descriptions?
So yes, I think if you took a very strong interpretivist line, then you would have to say that the very moment our best interpretation of a particular entity is one that ascribes not just intentionality, but also consciousness to that entity, then we have to take that at face value. But I think what that also illustrates, I think, is that interpretivism might be a defensible view, when it comes to agency. I mean, as I said, I go beyond interpretivism in embracing realism, but I mean, there's a good case to be made and made by other scholars in the literature for interpretivism. But I think when it comes to phenomenal consciousness, interpretivism would be intuitively not quite the right theory, because we precisely want to be able to distinguish between the philosophical zombie, at least conceptually speaking, the sort of entity that outwardly looks like a conscious being, but isn't, and then the paradigmatic human being who not just behaves outwardly as if they are conscious, but who truly are first personally conscious. So I think when it comes to phenomenal consciousness, a realist, a full-blown realist theory rather than an interpretivist theory is more compelling. But yeah, I think if our best theories of consciousness were to give us the verdict that a particular future AI system meets all the consciousness supporting conditions, then I suppose we'd have to say that's pretty strong evidence that the system truly is conscious. We're just not there at this point. No, thank you.
I'll assume you're satisfied, Anastasia, because you're not unmuting and demanding more. But you can come back if you want. We'll go to Juan. I hit ask to unmute.
Yeah, I think, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Good. Hi, Kristen. Thank you very much for your talk. I guess I have also a question about consciousness. And I guess, so when you were presenting the conditions for agency, it struck me that right away there was going to be this agreement between us in thinking that artificial intelligence systems can want things in the way that is required for agency, in that, in some sense, there doesn't seem to be a way of, at least machines would have to change a lot in order for me to be able to attribute something like caring for something or wanting in the way in which we ourselves want. I mean, of course, I can make sense of kind of saying the Roomba wants to get over to that side of the room, but that's kind of like, and I think kind of the folk would distinguish that kind of sense from the sense in which we want things. And so I started thinking, well, what is it that kind of sense of wanting or caring is that seems to me to be very important for responsibility? And it seems to be partly connected with consciousness. And so I started thinking, well, kind of given that I'm inclined to think of this case precisely as kind of avalanche kind of case where we cannot predict what they're going to do. But even if you think that there's a responsibility gap, I don't feel any push to go that way. But even if you felt that way and still wanted to say, well, there's still kind of an important distinction here. Why not think that consciousness is itself, or like a fallback on consciousness, is not only a condition for attributing rights, but also a condition for attributing responsibility, is the thought.
Right. So I think there are weaker and stronger notions of agency, and there are also weaker and stronger notions of intentionality. So I mean, one could have a thick notion of intentionality according to which some form of consciousness is already built into the definition of intentionality. So here the thesis would be that there aren't any intentional states without some associated phenomenal consciousness. So intentional states would then always simultaneously be phenomenal states as well. By contrast, on a thin definition of intentional agency and intentionality, consciousness is really separate, and intentionality is defined in weaker terms, for instance, in functionalist terms, provided the system has states that play the right kind of functional role in guiding its actions, that's good enough for intentionality independently of consciousness. Now, I mean, definitions are not really the kinds of things that are right or wrong. They are sort of more or less useful, and there might be room for both definitions depending on what your purposes are. I mean, I think that for many explanatory purposes, namely in the social sciences or in the behavioral sciences, where we are interested in third-personally explaining the interactions of a particular complex system with its environment, there is a lot of room for employing the notion of agency in the relatively thin functionalist sense, which can still be agency of an incredibly complex sort. And that's the way in which Philip Pettit and I approach the topic of group agency. And I assume that's also the way in which AI researchers think about AI systems typically. And on the face of it, I think that's a sort of perfectly good notion of agency. And I think there is even a version of moral agency that is defined on the sort of thin side of this spectrum, because you don't need to necessarily refer to phenomenal consciousness in order to make sense of notions such as normative cognition. And I find this persuasive enough to then make the case that, well, there is a sense in which corporations can actually be moral agents of a particular sort, and there is a sense in which they can meet standard conditions for fitness to be held responsible, even though they lack phenomenal consciousness. So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to observe that if we go for the thicker definition of intentional agency, then we'd end up with far more responsibility gaps, which, perhaps is not such a desirable consequence of using that system of definitions.
I have a short follow-up. Can I? Yeah. So I guess I was going for something a little bit more intermediate. So I wasn't thinking that it's a requirement for a system to have agency that they themselves be conscious. But I was thinking of the requirement a little bit more weakly, so that it would be compatible with your work on group agency, and the requirement would be that there is a fallback of consciousness. So that, for instance, when we make attributions of wants, there's at least a kind of background of interests and concerns in the individuals that form the, say, corporation, and more generally the group agent. And in as much as when we have an artificial intelligence system, we don't have that fallback, at least so far as the systems that we have, then there seems to be a kind of, what seems to me a very important disanalogy between even group systems. I'm willing to go with you that there's an important notion of agency that goes with that, and artificial intelligence systems.
But I suppose that line of reasoning places a lot of emphasis on this idea that what makes group agents, these special kinds of agents, is that they're made up of individual human members who are themselves human agents with consciousness and so on. And so I've actually kind of come to hold the view now that the fact that there are individual members in the background from a sort of metaphysical perspective is not really such a central feature of a group agent. I mean, it's obviously a central feature in how it is actually implemented, but from a metaphysical perspective, the group agent really is a new locus of agency. And so in that sense, really is an AI system, albeit implemented through a social as opposed to electronic hardware. And were you to hypothetically replace the social hardware with an electronic hardware, so you had robot members, that might be undesirable for society. But metaphysically, as far as the agent and its agential patterns of functioning are concerned, it might not make such a big difference.
So I have a sort of follow-up, but I'm going to control myself till the end, and I'll call on Susie.
So first of all, thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting, but also really comprehensive. So I feel like I learned a lot, and that was great fun. So I have just something a little bit different. I'm not going to be coming at it through the agency lens that a lot of people are thinking about. But when you were talking about responsibility for creating and using AI and the consequences that would follow, you mentioned a sort of strict liability regime as maybe a way, something that might be appropriate to avoid the responsibility gaps that people would try to hide behind and that sort of thing. And I was just thinking that this fits really well with products liability in US law, where there is a regime of strict liability. Yeah, I was wondering if you have that, or if you did have that in mind, and how you were thinking about that relationship. Would it just kind of be connected with that on your view? super interesting.
Yeah, no, this is this is exactly the right connection there. I mean, what I had in mind was basically this. I mean, in the case of corporate responsibility, we now already have certain systems in place to achieve corporate civil liability, and also to some extent even forms of corporate criminal liability. Obviously, different jurisdictions differ in the details here. In the AI case, we are not there yet. So at this point, it's much less clear what exactly it would mean to hold an AI system responsible itself. I mean, we kind of know now what it means to hold a corporation responsible, but we are much less clear about what it means to hold an AI system responsible. And if we were to then go with this kind of regulatory proposal that I sketched, you know, that you can only bring these AI systems into operation if you've made them responsible agents, then at this point it would mean we'd have a total prohibition on the use of such systems, which might also not be so desirable. And so, as a kind of interim compromise, I mean, before we figured out you know, how we can make those systems genuinely and properly responsible as moral agents in their own right, with, you know, all the regimes of sanctions and everything that is associated with this, the strict liability idea is a useful fallback, which you know, at least would put incentives in place to minimize the occurrence of terrible harms and responsibility gap situations as much as possible. So that's really the thought here.
You good, Susie? Okay. Oshin, I saw you lower your hand. If you want to raise it, don't worry. Okay. Eyal, you want to jump in? Let me unmute you. Nice.
Okay, I'm unmuted now, right? Yeah, thanks for a great talk. I have a question that I think dovetails off the last one, which is, how would it ever benefit us humans to hold, say, a self-driving car responsible? One big reason for holding a human responsible, I think, would be to motivate them to change their behavior. But if we can change the car's behavior through simple direct reprogramming, then what's the added benefit?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the added benefit, well, so there, I mean, there's several things that you might say here. I mean, in the for instance, I mean, take again first the corporate case. In the corporate case, you know, once you have some form of corporate civil or even corporate criminal liability, that of course very much changes the incentive structure for corporations. It you know, it disincentivizes certain forms of bad behavior, because in the absolute worst case, it could be it could mean the end of the corporation if you know, if it does something terrible. Now, in much the same way, you might say, you know, if you've got very complex AI systems in high stakes environments, if you have a system in place whereby an AI system would be, you know, would be punished in the sense of maybe, you know, switched off, deactivated, or something like that for certain breaches, that would very much change the incentive structure and would incentivize also different designs of the system in the first place. So that's just one kind of example. You could also imagine an example where, you know, just in the same way in which a corporation's liability is very often backed up by the assets that the corporation has, or the insurances that the corporation needs to purchase in order to be able to operate. You know, much the same could also apply for AI systems. So, you know, maybe if you have an AI system in a high stakes environment, the operating and the AI system is treated as a you know, responsible agent that, for instance, can be held liable, then you'd need to then make sure that there are insurance packages for this system in place, such that the liability for the system's actions is, backed up by the appropriate insurance funds or the appropriate insurance cover. So that's the sort of way in which you'd think about it. Obviously, you'd not. There are certain ways in which humans, precisely because we are conscious and all of this, are responsive to moral praise and blame, responsive to sanctions, that you can't quite achieve in exactly the same way in either a corporation or an AI system. But then there are other routes in which even a corporate or AI moral agent could actually be made responsive to outside praise and blame or outside sanctions.
Okay, I see Oshin, my collaborator who is in Toronto. So he might have the largest distance between our speaker and audience. Can you speak now, Oshin? You unmuted? Yes. Go ahead. I can't hear you. Still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Now we can hear you.
For some reason, the headphones just seem to not work with my computer. I have the settings all set up right, but something's wrong. So much for AI. Okay, so I've got a question. I really enjoyed the talk. Thanks very much, and thanks to Eddie for inviting me all the way from Toronto to hear it today. So the question I have is that going back to the agency stuff you talked about at the beginning. So I just think that my question is whether in thinking about AI agency and maybe group agency more generally in the way that you have worked on before, why it is that we should start with the idea of intentional agency. So just to explain a little bit, I think if anything, AI agents, as you pointed out, I think at one point, are currently much more like, well, you didn't make the point in this way, but they're much more like simple organism agents than anything like human intentional agents. I'm just wondering whether you can sort of get by with, and it might be useful to use a simpler notion of agency, maybe something taken from philosophy of biology or something like that. So you might think of an agent just as some system that has the capacity to attain goals in some sort of invariant way. Now, the goals here don't have to be thought of as some sort of intentional or representational state. You might say a system has a goal just in case it tends to attain or maintain that state of affairs, let's say, in some sort of invariant way. And the reason I think this might be useful is maybe twofold. First, I agree with you that the idea of moral pattern recognition, or something like what I would call intelligence in the appropriate intelligence in the moral domain, is the way to go in thinking about establishing the conditions of moral responsibility for an artificial system. But right now, I just think that starting with a sort of ramped up idea of intentional agency of the sort that we might attribute to humans is just the wrong place to start. And the second thought I had there was just that, if anything, reflecting on a simpler notion of agency in relation to artificial systems might actually have something to teach us about our own human moral agency. So I'm thinking roughly about cases like moral responsibility, or the question of moral responsibility for actions caused by implicit attitudes. So in those cases, it seems like the correct sort of conscious awareness and maybe even rationality aren't in play. And yet intuitively, at least, many people think that people should be and are, in fact, should be held and are morally responsible for certain actions caused by their implicit attitudes, implicit bias, more generally. And the idea that we might be able to get by with a simpler notion of agency in thinking about artificial systems might have something to tell us about even how we think about attributions of moral responsibility in cases where consciousness and rationality are less clearly visible even in our own case. But the question is just why it is that you think we need to start with intentional agency.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you're absolutely right that there's a whole spectrum of different notions of agency, and you know, at one very demanding end of the spectrum, you've got full-blown moral agency, and I mean, even that could, in principle, come in, you know, slightly different forms and shapes and sizes, but that's sort of one end of the spectrum. And then much simpler forms of agency are at some other end of the spectrum. So some simple homeostatic system or so might be at the extreme other end. And then you've got various intermediate cases. And I agree with you that intentional agency understood in this sort of three part, you know, belief, desire, action structure is already somewhere along this spectrum, and isn't sort of is not sort of at the far left end of the spectrum, so to speak. I also completely agree with you that, for instance, from the perspective of studying AI through the lens of philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and maybe reflecting on lessons that might be learned from the philosophy of biology, it's definitely very useful to also look at those simpler cases of agency, which no doubt are present in some AI systems as well. The reason I've focused on intentional agency and in particular is simply that since my focus here at the end of the day has been on lessons for responsibility and possibly even rights of the system in question, I sort of still take it that only systems that are at least intentional agents and in fact, you know, satisfy some stronger conditions are really plausibly candidates for certainly for bearing responsibility, but possibly also candidates for bearing certain kinds of demanding legal rights of the sort that you would associate with corporations or with universities and so on. And so that's why my focus really has been on those richer agential capacities. And I also think that you know, very often when we take something like this indispensability argument for group agency as a sort of starting point for one interesting reference case, it's really intentional agency that plays the sort of key explanatory role here, because the sorts of models of agency that scholars in economics use for corporations, or scholars in AR theory use for states, those are very much based on these decision theory, you know, rational choice type models, which are very much premised on the idea of intentional agency. Now, you're completely right that, I mean, even in an intentional agent with rich capacities, even in a moral agent, those perhaps other more basic layers of agency or psychological background capacities are also present, and those might indeed be importantly implicated in certain things that we do or don't do, and those things themselves might be of some moral significance. And so I totally take your point that we can also learn something useful from looking at those sort of more basic agential capacities.
I suspect you wouldn't mind following up, Oisin, but let's hear from Michael before we run out of time. And then I've got a last question I want to ask too. Michael, can you speak yet? I just hit ask to unmute. There it goes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great, wonderful. Thanks a lot for this wonderful talk. I'm Michael Hoffman. I'm from Georgia Tech. That's just down the road from Georgia State University. And I did my PhD in Munich at the LMU, so I'm kind of glad to see you here. So that's a nice connection.
That was wonderful to know.
Yeah. So I think I'm really impressed. That was a wonderful talk. I feel most challenged by your lessons about responsibility. And the reason is it seems to be counterintuitive. I mean, you know, if you think about racially biased AI, for example, you know, and that's a big discussion. But when we think about it, I mean, it's always people who are made responsible for the AI. So, I mean, people are looking into the data sets that are used to feed the machine learning engines and so on. So it's kind of counterintuitive. That's what I want to say with regard to that. But the reason for the fact that I think it is counterintuitive seems to me that there's really a fundamental disanalogy between the two agents that you distinguish. And that is AI, as we know it today, is a tool. And that is not the case for a group agent. A group agent is not a tool. But AI systems, at least as long as they are not conscious, you know, are certainly tools. They are designed by somebody, they are produced by somebody, they are deployed by a company like Uber who's using autonomous cars and so on. So I think taking into account, or the thesis into account, that AI is mainly a tool, at least today, then I think the challenge is really to define what exactly the responsibility gap is, right? So where is it really necessary, or what is what would be an example for a gap in responsibility? I mean, if you think about autonomous cars, you know, it's the software designer, it's the producer, manufacturer, it's Uber, but it's also the regulatory agency. I mean, if I am the mayor of a city and I allow that such a car is driven in my city, then I am responsibility for what's happening. And if you think about killer robots, for example, you could say it's the international community who is responsible to define new laws of war that would then take care of whether these systems should be used or not. So my question really is there a responsibility gap, and where exactly is it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's certainly true that in the case of AI systems that we would classify as relatively weak AI, it's not particularly intuitive at all to think of those systems as responsible. And the more a system is on the weak side of this AI spectrum, the more it makes perfect sense to think of it as a tool, and to really then you know, think of the human user of the tool as the main locus of responsibility, or the producer of the tool, or the designer, or whatever. So I completely take that point. But I mean, the issue is that I mean, this is a sort of rapidly developing technology that is, you know, quickly becoming more sophisticated, and now you might say that the autonomy of a self-driving car is still somewhat limited, but, you know, step by step, you know, we might have autonomous robots in medical contexts that engage, you know, quite independently and autonomously in certain care and treatment decisions. And so step by step, there could be less and less you know, real-time human intervention in the operation of those systems. So that's just one example. Or you could have the same with business decisions or investment decisions in the financial markets. And so as these systems become more and more independent in their decision making, potentially in high stakes settings, you know, then you're bound to have situations where massive harms are done. Now you might be right that in some of these cases, these different you know, human individuals or human entities, human corporations in the background, which you mentioned, which I also discussed, can then bear all the responsibility that is to be apportioned. You know, maybe in some cases it's appropriate to say, you know, the manufacturer or the operator was responsible, or the regulator. But, you know, much like in the corporate case, where you do have situations where, you know, all individuals did true diligence in all reasonable ways, and nonetheless, as a byproduct of complexity, something catastrophic happened that was sort of unforeseeable. You could have a similar situation here. And if you, and so then at least in principle, you are then faced with a choice between saying, do we treat this like a natural disaster or an avalanche, or do we want to make room for the possibility that, you know, the system itself was was a responsible agent. And my suggestion is, if the system is indeed a sufficiently strong AI system and it does have capacities that would warrant the attribution of agency, then let's at least discuss whether that system could be held responsible, much in the same way in which we treat a corporation also as a responsible agent, even if no individual member or very few individual members of the corporation were at fault for some harm that the corporation did. So that's really the line of reasoning here.
So I just want to make a couple of points for you to think about, Christian, and we don't have time for you to give lengthy answers here. But first of all, I wanted to thank you once again for your wonderful systematic talk that covered a really wonderful range of issues. Thanks for joining us for a second time in 2 weeks, late at night at Munich time.
My pleasure.
And if people need to go, that's understandable. But I did want to, I've been thinking about these issues a lot, and I'm curious, or maybe this is just food for thought for you, is to think about how much you think it's important to get the view lined up with the way ordinary people think about these issues. It's been coming up in some of the questions, and one of the ways I want to challenge you on that is in the way Juan was suggesting, that I've done some work with a student, Corey Allen, on people's attributions of consciousness, responsibility, free will, and other mental states to corporations, robots, and a bunch of animals. And one of the things we seem to find, and we need to do deeper studies, but one of the things we seem to find is that people think to have free will and to have responsibility, the agents need to have not just the sort of intentional states you're talking about and even motivational states, but they need to have phenomenal consciousness. And it looks like what they need to have is cares. So Juan mentioned that. They need to be able to care about things. And maybe people think corporations can care about things, but to a relatively low degree. And I think it's going to take a while for people to think robots can care. Unless they have some sort of phenomenal consciousness. And that's how it looks in the movies. I mean, the fiction writers get this right. The only time we start thinking that the robots are free and responsible is when it looks like they're worried about their own survival and they care about themselves or their other robots, like in Blade Runner or 2001 or anything where they really, they have to be motivated in a deep sort of way. I think that's an interesting thing for you to think about when you're developing this view, and just to tie it to the responsibility angle. I think it's also going to be the place where, if there's going to be a responsibility gap felt by people, it's going to be precisely on the retributive side of, because the utilitarian side, I think we can get around. Like we need to hold them responsible, corporations or robots, for all the forward-looking consequences. But when we're thinking about deserving blame, I think we really think the agent has to be the sort of thing that can care. And if they do something wrong, we feel like they should have cared about different things, and that's why they're responsible. So that was a long-winded way to have you think about some other issues, and you can answer it briefly if you want before we sign off.
Yeah, so I mean, as far as emotions and caring is concerned, I mean, here also, I guess we have a sort of bifurcation in how we can think about this. We can think about this in a functionalist way. Can ask, what is the functional role that emotional or caring states play in an agent? Or we can think about it in a sort of more phenomenal way. What are the first personal experiences that go along with this? As far as the functionalist side of emotions and caring is concerned, those functional states could in principle be present in a suitably designed corporation, and they could also be in principle present in a suitably designed AI system. Now, whether the phenomenal aspect of caring is also present, I mean, that then depends on this much harder question of whether there is phenomenal consciousness in those systems. And it's kind of difficult to, I mean, I sort of suspect that maybe the human intuitions that we have are driven not just by the functional aspects of caring, but maybe by the phenomenal ones as well. So that might indeed be what underlies those intuitions. And I think it's very interesting and useful and important to study those intuitions. But at the end of the day, I would also want to say that, well, our intuitions are based on, you know, our long-standing track record of experiences, both, I suppose, biological and cultural and historical, that, you know, we have as humans throughout human history. And those are based very much on an environment where you don't have AI systems, and also an environment where you don't have corporations. I mean, corporate group agents, you know, have been around for a few centuries or so, but, you know, not that much longer. And so whether the intuitions are the best guides to the design of suitable modifications for our normative systems to handle those new loci of agency, well, that's a challenging question. And in any way, I mean, this paper is meant to put some of these questions on the table for discussion, not necessarily to settle them.
That's a good way to finish it, because we got a lot of stuff to think about over the next decade or two when it comes to these issues. So thanks for the talk. Thanks for helping us see the connections between group agency and AI, which I don't think many people have pointed out so deeply. Hopefully we'll see you here in person someday.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure. And yeah, hope to see you some other time in the real world, not just the virtual world.
Okay.
Bye-bye then.